Hey guys, Brad here from Scooter Street. Look, I wanted to do a quick video today to discuss inner rotor ignitions. Now, specifically, what is an inner rotor ignition? How does it differ from the factory ignition? What advantage does it give you? And to do this, I have one of these really trick new MVT ignitions that we have for Piaggio 50cc models, liquid cooled and air cooled. We also have one for the Yamaha Aerox as well. So I'm going to go through this particular ignition, discuss the first couple of questions about inner rotor ignitions more generally. And then we're going to discuss what makes this inner rotor ignition so good, because these are a really trick new part. I want to discuss some of the differences with this particular ignition that give it a really good application for street scooters or street race scooters, people that are wanting to pretty much have a race scooter for the road. So we'll pop the box open, we'll have a quick look, and then we can get a little bit more in depth as we go. Okay, so here's all the parts that come in the box. I will just note that the box, displayed and set out of it's absolutely beautiful. It's really nice getting a product that has had quite a bit of effort spent in setting it out and displaying it. So obviously we've got our actual ignition here. So this is the coil with the flywheel unit being the two major components. And obviously the actual ignition part does sit on a backing plate. That's the design of this one. And one of the great things about this kit as well is it does come with a coil and CDI unit, as opposed to some other brands where you do need to purchase the coil and the CDI separately. Now, one more thing I will note with this particular ignition, you'll notice this plug here, which looks a little bit unusual. Now, if you're pretty familiar with old Piaggio engines, you'll notice that this is actually the stator plug for an older Piaggio engine. This is like your pre-1997 models, and obviously we've got our current model Piaggio Hyper 2 plug here. These are pretty much just daisied out of each other. So this is basically, you use the plug that is applicable to your scooter, which is quite clever. It means that this ignition is applicable to the early and the late model Piaggio engine. So we get to our first question: what is an inner rotor ignition? The best way to explain this is to show you how a factory ignition works. So if we're going to give a factory ignition its technical designation in the same way we do an inner rotor, we'd call a factory ignition an outer rotor. So I have a factory ignition here. So the way a factory ignition works is we have our static component, which bolts to the engine casing, and then we have the actual rotating component, which bolts to the crank. Now the rotating component sits outside of the static coil. So essentially the rotating component, which houses the magnet, this is the heavy component of the system, rotates outside of the actual coil component. Now when we compare this to an inner rotor ignition, the rotational part, or the flywheel, actually sits inside of the stator coil rather than on the outside of it, which gets the rotational mass down closer to the center of the crank. Now the next obvious question is going to be, what difference does this make in the real world? If I put an inner rotor ignition on my scooter, what difference does this make? This comes down to two major components, and they're linked. The first is rotational mass, and the second is centrifugal force. We'll explain rotational mass first. So rotational mass is the massive weight that the crankshaft physically has to spool up to get the engine revving. Now obviously there's a fairly large difference in weight between these two flywheels, between the inner rotor flywheel and the factory flywheel, just as dead weight. But when we get to the centrifugal force component, the way centrifugal force works is the further you remove the weighted component from the center of the crankshaft, the more centrifugal force is generated. Now under centrifugal force, it essentially increases the weight due to the RPM of that component. So when you take, say for instance, the factory flywheel, where the weighted component is on the outside of the component, it generates more centrifugal force, which essentially at RPM makes this item weigh exponentially more than it does at static. Now when you come to the inner rotor flywheel, because the weighted component of this flywheel is very close to the center of the crankshaft, it generates significantly less centrifugal force, which means that at RPM, significantly less exponential weight or force is generated due to that centrifugal effect. Now the difference this makes in the real world when you're revving your scooter, say on a high revving scooter with say a Bridgeport cylinder kit, talking about a mid-race or a race setup, if you're trying to rev your scooter, you roll the throttle on rapidly from say idle at 2000 RPM to say 10,000 RPM, an inner rotor ignition is supplying significantly less drag on the crankshaft as the engine tries to rev rapidly compared to the factory flywheel, which due to its weight and its centrifugal force, which essentially creates an exponential situation, making the problem worse, is going to be significantly more difficult for it to change RPM rapidly from say 2000 to 10,000 RPM. Now, most inner rotor ignitions from most other performance brands completely bypass the electrical system of the scooter and connect directly to the CDI and the coil. This is where the MVT ignition is a little bit different. It has a specific plug which connects to the stator plug of the scooter, where the factory plug connects. Now, this particular MVT ignition supplies a 12-volt line to the lighting coil pin of the factory stator plug. Now, what this means is where on another brand of inner rotor ignition, you wouldn't be able to run your lights with the inner rotor ignition installed. This particular MVT ignition, when installed as per the instructions, will run your headlight and your tail light. Now, if you're looking at running a street scooter or a road registered race scooter, this can be really advantageous because it means that you can still basically run on the road and have your lights. Now, where you do run into a little bit of an issue is running your electrical systems that run directly off the battery, because though it does supply power to the lighting, it doesn't supply power to your battery in the form of charge like the factory stator. So systems like your starter motor, your indicators, your brake lights, these all run off the battery. And so even running this ignition, you're still going to have the issue of your battery eventually being drained down. Now, if you're a little bit creative, what you can do, what this does allow you to do, is run the power line for the lighting coil instead to the battery, which just leaves you with the issue of sorting out some power for your tail light and your headlights, which can, if you're fairly creative and are competent with that sort of stuff, you can fairly easily sort out. I'd probably recommend, if you're going to do that, changing your headlight globe or headlight globes if you've got a twin light headlight scooter like an SR50R, and your tail light globe to an LED, so it's lower power consumption. But what you can do essentially is run the 12-volt line from this, which would normally go to the lighting coil, reroute the line to the battery so it's charging your battery, and that way you're still getting charged to your battery for all the electrical systems on the scooter, and you can just sort out another allocation of power to the tail and the headlights, which isn't too difficult to do. So basically what that would do is give you the ability to run an inner rotor ignition for that additional really snappy aggressive performance while still having 12-volt power to your scooter and being able to run it as a daily bike without having to externally charge the battery when the bike's not running, which can be a real pain. Speak from experience, I've done it myself. Now, coming to the application of this particular unit, or really of any inner rotor ignition, the best application of this unit is going to be a bike that's like a mid-race to a full race setup, say a road registered race bike or a dedicated race bike, in particular that's using a Bridgeport cylinder kit. So this is a cylinder kit that requires very high RPM to operate properly. And the reason for this is these aren't a particularly cheap unit, and unless you have a very high revving engine, you're not really going to see the full effect from it. Say, for instance, a more of a street bike, like say you have a Molossi Sport 70 kit, even an MHR replica. As these aren't particularly high revving cylinder kits, you're not going to see the full benefit from this unit that you would from a very high revving cylinder kit. This comes back to the centrifugal force effect. The more revs that you are generating, or the more rapidly that your cylinder kit is able to change an RPM, the better suited this unit is going to be to that bike. Now, if you have a street kit, that kit is probably going to hit its maximum ability to rapidly generate revs on its own without the factory stator being the thing that's holding it back. So this isn't to say that if you were to install one of these units on a more street orientated build that it's not going to be advantageous, but you're spending a lot of money for a relatively small difference, where on a bike like that, that same money could be allocated somewhere else for a significantly bigger difference. So it's really one of those things that you check off the list somewhere down the track once you've done most of the other major componentry of your engine build.